Hello folks, welcome to Changing Places number 5, if I can persuade it to work. Okay, so this video is all about a concept called the rural idyll and how that compares to the reality of rural areas. And there are pages in your module booklet about this, but there's not a huge amount of information, and therefore this is probably one part of the module that you would need some notes on. Okay, so the image that you're looking at probably, I don't know because I just found it on Google, but probably has some kind of filter applied. It looks like it's been digitally enhanced in some way, and that's kind of chosen on purpose. The rural idyll is this stereotypical view that the countryside is somehow perfect, wonderful, ideal, harmonious, peaceful, everything's brilliant all of the time. And that is the first idea that I need you to get. You don't have to learn this textbook definition of rural idyll, but you just need your own sentence or two where you can understand it in words that you know you're happy with. Idyll comes from ideal, so it is this idea that everything's fantastic and great and wonderful, okay? And it links back to a previous lesson which is on representation. The idea that this idea, the rural idyll, comes from the media. It comes from the representation of rural areas through images like this. You know, everyone's smiley and happy. There are spring lambs and daffodils and village fetes and cricket outside the village pub and sort of chocolate box. So they used to be called villages, very pretty villages that you can get postcards of. And it's all, you know, afternoon tea in the garden and long dog walks. Now, I'm not saying that that is not true, but what I am saying is that's not the full truth of the countryside. I grew up in the countryside. I know that this is not the full truth, and I'm sure you do too. So it comes back to representation. It's the way that the way that rural areas tend to be represented in the media is this concept called the rural idyll. But we are geographers, we know that that's probably not the full truth. And so actually what we're now going to look at is what's the reality of rural areas. And if you have a module booklet, there is a little space for notes on this. Now, we don't need to write down loads of information, but it's this kind of thing. House prices tend to be more expensive. You might be sat there thinking, well, yes, Nikki, that's because houses are bigger and they've got bigger gardens. Okay, but we don't sort of need to get too bogged down in that. Bottom line, house prices in rural areas are more expensive. Rural areas in the UK are dominated by slightly older people. So here is the average for England, and look at the difference between the two. This will partly be explained, of course, by something we talked about previously called the life cycle model. The idea that people live in a place that suits their needs, and younger people will find themselves therefore in urban areas because there are flats to rent, there are universities, there's jobs, there's public transport, there's nightclubs, there's pubs. The stuff that young people want tends to be in urban areas. The stuff that older people want tends to be in the countryside, and therefore we see this quite big difference, and it becomes even more marked, look, if you look at kind of how remote rural areas get, which I will explain to you in another lesson. But if you're quite near urban areas, it's pretty even. If you go out into the really remote parts of the countryside, it becomes very much top heavy with older people. And we'll talk about why that is from a slightly different perspective very shortly. So just remember, we're not putting down loads of detail. We're just jotting down, okay, what's the truth? Well, the truth is that house prices are more expensive. There are more older people living in the countryside. They're mainly white people living in the countryside. Now, as I speak, it is March 2021, and we are very close to doing another census. A census is a big survey of everybody in the UK that we do every 10 years. So unfortunately, as I speak right now, the most up-to-date data I can give you is from 2011. But within the next few months, we should actually get the new data, which will be very exciting. But the darker the shade of purple, the more white dominated the place is, and you can see that the more rural parts of the UK have generally got the darker shades of purple. And here are just a few named places. So the Isles of Scilly are 98.8% white people, or Northumberland 98.4%. You don't need a named place. I just wanted to prove to you that this is true. So they're not very multicultural there. They're very white dominated. Next, rural reality. There's actually quite a lot of poverty in the countryside, which our brains often find quite difficult to comprehend. I did a module on this at university, and rural poverty is quite hard for us to understand, because for some reason we don't equate poverty with beautiful places. It's kind of, it doesn't add up in our head. But there's 980 households in rural Britain below the official poverty line, so who have an annual income of less than 16,492 a year. So that's pretty incredible, isn't it? And I would highly recommend, I know it's a bit of a Russian doll video within a video thing, but this is only 10 minutes and it's really informative about the issue of poverty in rural Britain. So I would highly recommend that you either watch it after I finished here, or you pause me and watch that one. I suspect some of you watching this video are only too aware of this. Generally speaking, rural areas don't have quite such good internet. The broadband speed is much slower, which can be incredibly frustrating for people living in rural areas. Again, it does massively vary. Look, if you're quite near a town or a city, it's pretty good. But as you get into the really remote places, it's really quite bad. And all of them, compared to the urban, I mean, it's called the digital divide, if you want the proper phrase, but you can really see the digital divide quite obviously there. That also applies to mobile phone signal. So digital deprivation is to do with broadband speed, but also things like mobile phone signal and access to the internet. Anywhere that's red has got the biggest problems. Again, it's the rural parts of the UK. If you live in the countryside, you pretty much have to travel everywhere. These are called divided bars. So the height of the bar represents the total, but then you can divide it up by type. And you can see they've got a colour coding system down here. We're only interested really in the height of the bars, to be honest. I just wanted to show you divided bars because over the course of the A-level, I try to show you as many different graphs and images as I possibly can. Just notice, look, that people in rural areas seem to have to travel more. And if we start to put this together with some of our other realities, we've got high house prices, generally older people, we've got high amounts of poverty, and now we're finding out that people have to travel. Well, this is adding up to be pretty bad, isn't it? Because people haven't got, not everyone in the countryside has got that much money, but you have to drive wherever you go because chances are you're not going to have particularly good public transport. So the blue is people who have access to a frequent bus. It's all explained in the box at the bottom, whereas the green, look, less than half of people in the remote countryside have got access to a bus. This is genuinely true, the village that I grew up in, there was one bus a week on a Wednesday afternoon. And honestly, I'm not joking, one bus a week on a Wednesday afternoon. And if you wanted to go anywhere else, you had to persuade somebody to drive you. And as a result of all those problems, guess what? People are leaving the countryside, particularly younger people. They get fed up And this may well be ringing a few bells in your particular mind as you're watching this, going, yes, Nikki, this is my life. People get fed up of rubbish broadband and poor phone signal and not being able to meet up with their mates very quickly, or having good access to education, or there's just not anything for young people to do. So we are seeing people leaving rural areas in droves, and it's called rural depopulation. So that's partly the reason that you get older people left behind, because they tend to be more or less happy with the situation, whereas younger people are not. And it's particularly because of the decline of the primary sector. As the primary sector gets smaller, there are fewer and fewer jobs for people to do. And it triggers something called the spiral of decline. I'll come back to that other graph in a second. So people, especially the young, leave for more opportunities in urban areas. Can you blame them? Absolutely not. Then employers find it difficult to recruit labour, and they might start closing. All of these job losses and people moving away means that people don't have much money and there aren't many people. So the shops and services start to close. Because if people can't afford to use them, or there just are not any people left to use them, you start to see your schools closing, your post offices closing, all of that starts to go wrong. And then there's lower quality of life and more people start to leave, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So the spiral of decline is kind of triggered by all of the things that we've talked about before. This graph picks up on something we've mentioned earlier. We said, I think this will have been in video number 3, that the decline of the primary sector is caused partly by mechanisation, which is the replacing of people by machines. And what this graph proves is that the number of farms has gone down, but they've got bigger, because as you can use these whacking great machines, you can farm a much bigger space. But the job losses cause that. And then you might get the problem of second homes. So rich people who live in towns and cities might decide that they want a little countryside retreat for weekends and holidays. Because they are quite rich, they push the house prices up. And that links back to the first point we looked at. But it has another problem, which is that second homeowners are not part of the community. They're not using the local shops and services. So although they physically own the house, they don't really help with any of that spiral of decline stuff. In fact, by pushing the house prices up, the problem sort of actually gets worse, to be honest. Because if the house prices were lower, young people might be more inclined to stay. But if the house prices are too expensive, there's not a point. And this graph just proves that the things that we possibly attribute as being urban problems can be rural problems as well. And in fact, some of them may well be worse in rural areas than they are in urban ones. And that just talks about the issue of second homes and how it causes problems, just to persuade you that I don't make things up, really. 3 rural post offices close every week. So rural reality is not very jolly. It's pretty, but there are some fairly difficult issues going on. Okay, so it's this contrast, if you like, of this rural idyll where everything's wonderful, and the fact that it's not quite so clear cut as that, really. And as ever, life is a bit more complicated than we might first imagine. Okay.